Hi, welcome to Atheist Edge. I'm Sam.
I'm Courtney.
And today's talk is about temporal lobe epilepsy and its relation to religious experience. Title of today's talk is Seizure Your Way to God. Religionists and mystics have long claimed to have experience of a supernatural reality. These experiences often inform the metaphysical structures upon which man's relation to God and reality is based. Founders of religions like Joseph Smith for Mormonism, Muhammad for Islam, and Paul for Christianity have claimed that their experiences prove their veracity. When a claim is objectively true, it's true no matter if you believe it or even understand it. For instance, computers work whether or not you understand silicon microcircuits. A Hindu who claims that reality is an illusion can still use a cell phone sending signals to satellites without any knowledge or belief in Western physics or relativity. While there are commonalities of religious experience, which we'll talk about today, the actual content of religious teaching is varied and mutually exclusive. This shows that religious experience does not contain objective knowledge of reality. Where religious experience has overlaps, it's because the anatomy and function of the human brain is an objective reality to be known. So, getting started with this, with the temporal lobe, it's a specific part of the brain, and your expertise, Courtney, is in psychology and a little bit of basic neuroscience. Can you explain a little bit what the temporal lobe is, where it's at in the brain?
Yeah, temple. It's kind of a it's described with like your temples here. So basically, if you take where your temples are and you kind of go a little bit in,
okay, so
that's,
right here,
yeah, that entire kind of portion is going to be your temporal lobe.
It makes like this little curly loop, right? And it's got these little lobes
it's kind of like
on the end.
It's kind of like doing that on your head. But basically, it's on both hemispheres, and it's on either side of your head. Basically.
And it's from when we were talking earlier, it's more in the center of the brain, just outside, just above the hippocampus and the amygdala.
Right. So the temporal lobe, it kind of describes that general area of what's on the sides, and so you have your brain stem, which comes up to about here, and then on top of that is going to be the midbrain, and then blanketing over that is the cortex. So on the cortex, on that outside, is the temporal lobe, and then as you go in all the way to the center, those are all going to be associated in their location by saying temporal. So if you hear so like the temporal limbic system is the temporal parts of the middle of the brain. So you've got like say this is the center of the brain. You've got the hippocampus wrapping around, and on the edges of that you have the amygdalas, and then wrapping over all of that, those like that when you see like a brain on TV, you have like all those squiggly lines. That's all on that blanket on top, and that's the cortex.
Gotcha.
And actually, interestingly enough, that's the main part of what kind of constitutes our higher level thinking, and so that's kind of what separates the more intelligent primates like dolphins and apes and us above it creates that intellectual ability and reasoning
now
that other animals don't have.
What does the temporal lobe do? Like, what is its functions?
Well, if you Google it, it's kind of, in general, it's auditory systems. So it's the receptors of that, and if you damage parts of that part of the brain, then it'll affect all kinds of auditory things.
Does it doesn't also have relation to our other senses as well, not just auditory, but like visual, olfactory, tactile?
Well, everything's kind of connected in the brain. So if you have like a damage in one part, then the brain sort of compensates. And what's interesting is if it's a completely functioning brain, all of those parts kind of help each other out, and they're all engaged in the overall function. It's one of those myths about we only use 10% of our brain. It's not at all true. It's kind of we use all of our brain, and it's kind of a strange myth about it. But anyway, temporal lobe. it has that specific function, but if you get into the center of the brain, the limbic part, that part is going to be engaged in a lot of those other things. So like in that part of it, you have the hippocampus that's part of that limbic part, and so the hippocampus is really interesting. It's spatial navigation, and it regulates your emotions, and what's interesting is when we're getting into the topic, it's kind of involved in assigning negative and positive attributes to things, and so it's part of why if you have a hallucination, it's going to have this kind of profound effect that you have. It sticks in your mind.
It feels significant.
Right, and also
because that part of the brain processes emotional significance of events.
Right. Well, and the amygdala is kind of the kind of emotions of anger and sadness, and it kind of controls aggression. But what's interesting about the limbic system in that is that the amygdala is where you're going to get memories of it helps to store memories of events and emotions to prepare you to recognize them and avoid them in the future. So it'll respond to anger and fear, and it will store those memories and make you much more vivid of those memories, negative experiences, in order to avoid them. It's like a defense mechanism, and that's kind of why, if you have something negative that happens to you that causes a lot of fear and anxiety, your body and your brain, it protects itself, probably from an evolutionary standpoint,
right,
to avoid those in the future, and so it sticks it in your mind so that you'll be prepared next time, basically.
Now, where does this tie in with religious experiences? How is it that an epileptic seizure of the temporal lobe produces religious experience? Like, why are we even talking about it?
Right. Well, so basically, if you have epilepsy, then your seizures will be caused by some sort of abnormality in the brain, and if that abnormality stems from the what they call the temporal limbic system, which is like the limbic system is that center of the brain underneath that blanket, and so in that blanket, in the temporal part of it, so like here and here, those parts are going to be what causes, if you have a seizure that affects that part, it's going to cause hallucinations, in not all cases, but basically, epilepsy. In the seizures, if you have, a seizure in another part of the brain, it might cause a totally different experience. But what they've found in these studies we've been looking at is that in the temporal lobe, if you have that in the temporal middle brain, then those are going to cause this a lot of hallucinations and what we were talking about in previous videos about derealization, depersonalization, and more specifically, you have I have a testimonial of someone who has one of those epileptic seizures.
This is Dostoevsky. Is that how you say his name?
Yeah.
This is.
It says The Idiot.
Yeah, well, that's the name of the book. But he wrote a bunch of things. I'm not an expert on Dostoevsky, but a classic Russian writer, I believe. But go ahead and read this. This is fantastic.
Yeah. So it says so this is kind of describing the experience of a person that's having a temporal epileptic episode, and that's causing kind of a hallucination. So the air was filled with a big noise, and I thought it was engulfing me. I have really touched God. He came into me. Myself, yes, God exists. I cried, and I don't remember anything else. You all healthy people, you said, can't imagine the happiness which we epileptics feel during the second before our attack. I don't know if this felicity lasts for seconds, hours, or months, but believe me, for all the joy that life may bring, I would not exchange this this one. So it's, oh my gosh, it's really interesting. So what's interesting about that part of the brain and epileptic episodes there is that it tends to make you assign a lot of weight to it, like I was saying before. Mm-hmm. But what that does is, if you feel like you have a out of body experience, if you leave, like there was a guy in here whose testimony said that he was in a store and he had a seizure, and he was very aware of where he was, and then what happened was in his seizure he leaves the store and goes to a celestial dimension and comes back, and these, for the person experiencing this, and for anybody who knows anything about hallucinations and how vivid and real they are, they're auditory and sensory, or they're auditory and visual, and so these are extremely real experiences. And
now the particular experiences, they describe them in the literature here: depersonalization, derealization, dreamy states, autoscopy, ecstasy. And whenever someone is right about to have an epileptic seizure, or they're in the middle of it, they'll experience fear, déjà vu, jamais vu, memory recall, and visual and auditory hallucinations. And what's so interesting, though, about all of these things is how much they parallel statements by religious mystics from many different backgrounds: Christian, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Mormon. There's commonalities in the experiences that they have, like Dostoevsky described over here. And we're gonna show up here a chart. This was in our source article for this by Seizure, and he talks, or in these charts here, it shows certain religious leaders who have been suspected of having epileptic seizures. For instance, Paul, Muhammad, Joan of Arc, Saint Catherine of Genoa,
Van Gogh, Van Gogh,
Van Gogh, Joseph Smith of Mormonism. And there's it appears that this is common enough that that it forms the core of religious experience. Now, they claim that these experiences are providing knowledge of a supernatural reality above and beyond this one. But because the content of the religious messages are different in form, for instance, Christianity says it's all about Jesus and his death and resurrection on the cross, whereas you go with Islam and it's about Allah and Muhammad. But one of the things that's common is they do emphasize a uniting with God, a oneness.
Seeing a light.
Yeah, and seeing a light. But depersonalization and derealization are common psychological states that have parallels in the religious literature. Now, somebody who is less aware of mystical traditions or religious teachings, when they have these things, they don't necessarily ascribe religious content to their experiences. They just know something strange is going on. And then they can go to a doctor and figure out, hey, wait a second, I've got epileptic seizures here. And
one thing that that kind of was interesting to me is that if you have this type of the temporal limbic epilepsy, if you have those type of seizures, then your interpretation of what happens is affected by your previous worldview. But what I thought was really interesting was what happens in the hallucination itself will be specific to what you previously believed. So if you have a and it's not always, but if you have someone who believes in Allah, then they can report and it has been reported that they'll see Muhammad in front of them and they'll have a conversation with them during their seizure and after the seizure. And then the same thing. There was a woman who was quoted on here saying that she saw a bearded man that resembled Jesus, and it's it's very interesting to me that the not only what we interpret as, because people talk about your previously held understanding, it shapes your worldview, or your worldview will shape what's coming at you, and so your experience is going to be interpreted through that kind of lens of your previously held worldview. But what I thought was really interesting was these visions that are said to be, more real than what we experience here and now. They're so subjective to what you previously believe, and so if it was a claim to have some sort of access to a higher power that's real, then these different delusions would be consistent. It would be the same type of sensory experience,
actually,
or they would be seeing the same
We couldn't
people.
even call them delusions by definition,
Right.
because at that point, to call them a delusion assumes that you have knowledge of objective reality upon which to make the claim that these are delusions. Furthermore, while the commonalities of the physiological experience of so-called numinous experiences or transcendent experiences, the difference in the specific religious content across human populations and geography indicate that there is no core consensus. There is nothing that can be subject to confirmation, unlike what has been produced by the scientific method. That's why the scientific method allows us to come to a greater understanding of reality rather than internal brain states. While we must use our brains to understand reality, we can show that epileptic seizures are not normal brain states. They're malfunctionings. They do not show reality as it really is.
And that's what's crazy about that part of the brain, is that because it's affecting the hippocampus in these patients, in that type of epilepsy, they tend to interpret what they're experiencing in their hallucination as more real than their everyday experience. And that's something that's specific to, because it's affecting that part of the brain, that's a side effect of that, which is really, it's very, very fascinating to me.
Exactly. Cool. So in wrapping up, in conclusion, temporal lobe epilepsy is more than likely the basis for the religious content, I'm sorry, not the religious content, but the religious experience that many mystics have. Because the content is varied across geography and across people, we can know that it's not objectively real, whereas a scientific method does produce that. Thank you so much for joining us on the Atheist Edge. I'm Sam.
I'm Courtney.
Cheers.